The village of Obinna was wrapped in a deceptive calm as the sun began to dip behind the ancient Iroko trees. It was the day Amara had dreamed of since she was a little girl playing with palm fronds. The courtyard was decorated with ivory fabrics and fresh hibiscus, yet a cold shiver danced down Amara's spine. As she stood adjusting her silken wedding veil, she noticed her elder sister, Ijeoma, moving through the space like a quiet shadow. Ijeoma was not smiling. Instead, she was busy rearranging the ceremonial flowers and shifting the placement of the sacred calabashes. Every time Amara placed an item, Ijeoma subtly moved it to a different corner. The guests began to arrive, their voices dropping into low, jagged whispers as they watched the elder sister's strange behavior. Amara felt a sudden, sharp sting of betrayal, though she couldn't name the crime yet. Why was Ijeoma touching the offerings meant for the ancestors? Amara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked toward the village priest and saw Ijeoma leaning close to his ear, her lips moving in a rapid, silent rhythm. When the priest looked up, his eyes held a gaze of deep moral unease that made Amara want to scream into the heavy, humid air. As the drums began their rhythmic thumping, the atmosphere grew thick with an unspoken tension. Ijeoma stepped into the center of the courtyard, her presence growing larger than the bride's. She didn't ask for permission, she simply took command, guiding the servants with sharp, hand-flick gestures and directing the guests where to sit. Amara tried to speak, her voice trembling as she asked why the seating arrangements had been changed from what they had planned for months. But Ijeoma didn't even turn around. It was as if Amara had become invisible in her own home on her own wedding day. The envy and betrayal in the air were so thick you could almost taste them, like the bitter juice of a crushed herb. The guests exchanged looks of confusion, their colorful wrappers rustling as they shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ijeoma's domination was not loud or violent, it was a quiet, suffocating authority that left no room for protest. Amara looked toward the elders, the keepers of tradition, hoping they would stop this madness. One elder started to stand, his wooden staff trembling in his hand, but he caught Ijeoma's cold, unwavering gaze. He hesitated, his throat working as he swallowed his words, and slowly sat back down, refusing to intervene in the sisterly storm. The ceremony proceeded, but every step felt like walking through a field of hidden thorns. Small acts of sabotage began to reveal themselves, chipping away at Amara's composure. When she reached for her bridal veil to cover her face, she found a long, jagged tear running through the delicate lace, as if a claw had snagged it. The sacred offerings of kola nut and alligator pepper were misaligned on the wooden tray, a sign of great disrespect to the spirits. Amara looked at the groom, Chidi, expecting to find a pillar of strength, but he looked pale and distant. He stood at the altar, his hands shaking slightly, his eyes darting toward Ijeoma every few seconds. Amara reached out to touch his hand, a gesture of kindness and reassurance, but the moment she moved, Ijeoma coughed softly. It was a small sound, yet it acted like a physical barrier. Chidi flinched, pulling his hand away mid-vow as if he had been burned by an invisible flame. Amara felt the power imbalance shifting the very ground beneath her feet. The audience leaned forward, sensing that the strings of this marriage were being pulled by hands that did not belong to the bride or the groom. The air grew colder as the evening shadows stretched across the red earth. During a brief pause in the music, an elder named Pa Ojo leaned toward Amara in a dim-lit side corridor. His breath smelled of old tobacco and wisdom, and his eyes were clouded with age. "Listen to me, daughter," he whispered, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "There is a debt in this house that the walls have not forgotten." Amara tried to pull away, her mind focused on the embarrassment of her disrupted wedding, but the old man's grip was surprisingly firm. He warned her that the group was ignoring a growing moral guilt that would soon swallow the celebration whole. Amara brushed his words aside, thinking he was merely senile or caught up in old superstitions. She wanted her perfect day back, not riddles about ancient debts. She turned back toward the courtyard, ignoring the heavy warning in his gaze. As she walked past a group of women from the neighboring compound, she heard a sharp mutter that stopped her breath. She always wanted this, a woman whispered, her eyes fixed on Ijeoma's back. Even if Amara was too blind to know the reason why. The seeds of doubt finally took root in Amara's soul. In the silence of her mind, Amara found herself drifting back to their childhood, back to the dusty years when they were just girls. She saw a soft-focused memory of a young Ijeoma standing on the outskirts of the village square while the other children played. Ijeoma had always been the one left behind, the one who carried the heavy water pots while Amara was praised for her beauty and grace. Their parents had overlooked Ijeoma's quiet sacrifices, taking her labor for granted while they celebrated every small achievement of their younger daughter. Ijeoma had spent her youth mourning the slights that no one else noticed, burying her pain beneath a mask of stoic duty. Now, as Ijeoma meticulously arranged the wedding rituals, her movements mirrored the way she used to fold Amara's clothes or clean Amara's room, with a silent, terrifying precision. Each flower she moved was a memory of a time she had been pushed aside. She was reclaiming the space she had never been allowed to own. Amara watched her sister's face and realized that the hatred she felt wasn't just about the wedding, it was about a lifetime of being treated like a ghost in her own family's house. A strange, mystical tension began to ripple through the wedding party as the ritual fire was lit. The smoke from the incense did not drift upward toward the heavens as it usually did. Instead, it hugged the ground, swirling around the sisters' ankles like gray snakes. A small flame flickered unusually high, casting long, distorted shadows that danced against the mud walls of the compound. The villagers began to shift their weight, their faces etched with a growing unease. They could feel the ancestral oversight, the sense that the spirits were watching this twisted ceremony with great displeasure. "The spirits are restless tonight," an old woman whispered, clutching her beads tightly. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if the air itself was charged with electricity before a great storm. Amara looked at the fire and saw her own reflection in the flickering light, looking small and fragile against Ijeoma's towering resolve. Moral consequence was foreshadowed in every spark that flew into the dark sky. The audience sensed that this was no longer a simple family quarrel, but a reckoning that involved forces far older than the village itself. The drums grew slower, matching the heavy heartbeat of a community waiting for the sky to break open. As the night deepened, Amara began to notice something even more painful than her sister's behavior, the complicity of the community. She looked around the wide courtyard and saw her own cousins and aunts assisting Ijeoma. They weren't fighting her, they were nodding in silent approval as Ijeoma whispered new instructions to them. Amara's best friend, who was supposed to be her chief bridesmaid, avoided her eyes, instead focusing on a tray of kola nuts that Ijeoma had commanded her to carry. The betrayal was spreading through the crowd like a slow-moving poison. Amara realized she was being isolated in the very place she was supposed to be celebrated. Every time she tried to catch someone's eye for help, they turned away, suddenly busy with a garment or a cup of palm wine. The villagers seemed to have made a collective decision to let Ijeoma take the lead, as if they knew a secret that Amara was not privy to. The tension rose in the audience as they watched the bride become a stranger at her own feast. Amara felt a cold wall of isolation rising around her, realizing that her sister's power didn't come from force, but from a truth the others already recognized. Suspense continued to build as the moon rose high over Obola. Amara, feeling a sudden need to escape the suffocating crowd, slipped into the inner room where the bridal gifts were stored. The room was lit only by a single, flickering candle, its yellow light reflecting off the brass bowls and woven baskets. As she reached for a cup of water, her eyes fell on a pile of ancient, candlelit scrolls tucked beneath a ceremonial stool. She pulled one out, her heart racing as she saw hidden writing scrawled across the parchment in dark, hurried ink. The words were a jagged warning that made her blood turn to ice. "You will see too late," the note read, the ink still smelling faintly of charcoal. Before she could process the message, a floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around to find Ijeoma standing in the doorway, her silhouette blocking out the lights from the courtyard. Ijeoma didn't look angry, she wore a knowing, subtle smile that was far more terrifying than a scowl. "Found something, little sister?" she asked, her voice as smooth as polished stone. She moved into the room silently, her eyes never leaving Amara's, making it clear that every move was part of a deeper, unstoppable plan. The stakes of the night took on a cultural weight that Amara had never considered. In the center of the square, the village head priest brought out the ancestral ledger, a heavy book of carved wooden slats that held the history of every family in Obinna. He pointed to a specific carving, his finger tracing the ancient grooves as flickering shadows played over the wood. The audience leaned in, realizing that the tension they were witnessing was linked to a moral inevitability from long ago. There were debts mentioned in that ledger, ancestral debts that had never been paid, promises made by Amara's father that had been broken in the dark. Amara looked at the ledger and spotted symbols that mirrored the ones Ijeoma had been drawing in the dust earlier that morning. These were not just sibling rivalries, they were the consequences of past deeds influencing the present moment. The sense of an ancient reckoning hung over the courtyard like a heavy shroud. Amara realized that she was not just marrying Chidi, she was standing at the center of a historical storm that Ijeoma had spent years preparing for. The realization that her life was a pawn in an ancestral game made her legs feel like water. A false, deceptive calm settled over the wedding as the main feast was served. The courtyard looked beautiful under the moonlight, the sun having long since departed, leaving a silver glow over the guests. To a stranger, it might have looked like a perfect celebration, but the disruptions were still there for those who knew where to look. The palm wine was served in the wrong order, and the music played at a tempo that was slightly off, creating a sense of looming betrayal. Ijeoma sat at the head table, her face a mask of serene control, while Amara sat beside her, feeling like a ghost. The calm only served to mask the chaos that was waiting just beneath the surface. The audience could feel the pressure building, like a dam about to burst. Ijeoma turned her head and smiled subtly at Amara, a look that said she held every string of the evening in her capable hands. It was a terrifying grace, a quiet before the ultimate roar of justice. Amara wanted to scream, to break the silence, but the weight of the collective gaze kept her frozen in her seat. She was waiting for the moment the mask would finally slip. The groom's role in this drama became painfully clear during the traditional vows. As Chidi stood before the priest, he hesitated, his voice cracking as he tried to speak the ancient words of commitment. The audience began to question his loyalty as his eyes constantly flicked toward Ijeoma for direction. Amara's confusion deepened into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Was Chidi a victim of her sister's manipulation, or was he a willing participant in this takeover? When he faltered on a crucial line about protecting his household, Ijeoma stepped forward and whispered something quietly into his ear. Whatever she said acted like a magic spell. He straightened his shoulders and finished the vow, but his eyes remained hollow and devoid of love for the woman standing beside him. Her influence was growing by the minute, weaving itself into the very fabric of the marriage contract. Amara felt as though she were watching a play where everyone had the script except for her. The moral ambiguity of Chidi's position added a new layer of suspense, leaving the audience wondering if he was a husband or a hostage in this unfolding family tragedy. In a rare moment of quiet, Ijeoma retreated to a candlelit corner of the compound to prepare the final ritual items. Amara followed her, driven by a desperate need for answers. The shadows on Ijeoma's face made her look older, her features softened by the warm glow of the flame. For a moment, she looked human, vulnerable, and tired. She turned to Amara and spoke in a voice that was low and hauntingly honest. "You think this is about you, Amara," she whispered, her fingers tracing the rim of a brass bowl. "But it is about the balance of things. All debts must be paid tonight, and I am the only one with the courage to sign the check." Amara felt a sudden, unexpected wave of sympathy for her sister. She saw the calculated nature of her actions as a burden rather than a joy. Ijeoma wasn't acting out of a simple desire for a wedding, she was fulfilling a destiny she felt was her sole responsibility. The audience realized that her actions were not random acts of cruelty, but a deliberate, painful path toward a resolution only she understood. She was a woman carrying the weight of a family's sins on her back. The public sabotage reached a peak during the traditional dance of the sisters. As they moved to the center of the ring, Ijeoma subtly changed the steps, forcing Amara to stumble and look clumsy in front of the entire village. Ritual items were rearranged right before the final blessing, creating a wave of shocked whispers in the crowd. Amara's authority as the bride was completely undermined. She looked like an intruder in her own ceremony. She looked toward her closest friend, seeking a sign of support, but her friend hesitated, her hands frozen by her side, unwilling to intervene against Ijeoma's overwhelming presence. The audience tension rose as they wondered if anyone would have the courage to stand up for the bride. It was a painful display of social power, showing how easily a person can be erased when the community chooses to look the other way. Each misstep and moved item was a public declaration that the old order was being overturned. Amara felt her spirit breaking under the weight of the collective silence, realizing that the people she loved were watching her downfall with a mixture of pity and fascination. Finally, Amara found her voice and confronted Ijeoma in front of the elders. "Why are you doing this?" she cried out, her voice echoing through the courtyard. "This is my day, my life." But Ijeoma didn't flinch. Instead, she turned to the villagers and reframed the conflict with a voice that sounded like righteousness itself. She spoke of the sacrifices she had made, of the times she had protected the family name while Amara was off playing, and of the hidden cracks in the marriage agreement that only she had seen. The villagers began to clap, their applause starting as a trickle and growing into an ambiguous roar. The audience experienced a sharp belief reversal. Suddenly, Ijeoma appeared to be the hero, the one saving the family from a disastrous union. Amara stood there, her mouth open in shock, as she realized she had lost all moral authority in the eyes of the village. She was the spoiled younger daughter, and Ijeoma was the long-suffering guardian of tradition. The cliffhanger left Amara standing alone in the center of the square, her white dress looking like a shroud as the village turned its back on her cries for justice. As night truly fell, the atmosphere took on a quiet, mystical horror. The ritual fire cast long, unnatural shadows that seemed to dance independently of the flames, their silhouettes twisting into strange, ancient shapes on the walls. The air smelled of ozone and damp earth, signaling an ancestral reckoning was close at hand. The audience leaned in, anticipating the supernatural weight of the night to finally reveal itself. In the shadows behind the main house, a hidden observer, the old Pa Ojo, whispered to the wind. "Tonight, all debts are paid," he muttered, his eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire. The silence of the night was louder than the drums, filled with the presence of things unseen. Amara felt as though the spirits of her ancestors were standing just beyond the light, judging the community for its secrets. The sense of dread was palpable, a physical weight that pressed down on every guest. This was no longer a wedding, it was a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided in the world of the spirits. The village held its breath, waiting for the first sign of the inevitable collapse of the lies they had lived by for so long. In a desperate moment, Amara cornered Chidi near the back of the compound. She grabbed his arm, her eyes searching his face for a spark of the man she thought she loved. "Tell me the truth," she demanded, her voice a ragged whisper. The groom's secret finally spilled out in the shadows, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and relief. "I had no choice, Amara," he confessed, his head bowing in shame. "The debt your father owed my family, it wasn't just money. It was a pact made in blood that Ijeoma discovered." Amara felt her word peak in confusion. "You knew all along," she whispered, her hand falling away from his arm as if he were a stranger. He nodded silently, his eyes fixed on the red earth at his feet. The audience reevaluated all the alliances they had seen throughout the story. Chidi wasn't a hero or a victim, he was a participant in a transaction that had started before he and Amara were even born. The betrayal was deeper than a sister's envy, it was a systemic failure of honesty that had led them all to this broken altar under the moonlight. The revelation began to fracture the community as word of the secret pact spread through the whispers of the guests. Villagers who had been nodding in approval now looked at each other with faces contorted by guilt and suspicion. They started to take sides, some defending the family's honor and others calling for the truth to be fully revealed. Murmurs and pointed fingers filled the air as the social tension escalated toward a breaking point. The audience saw the moral decay of a village that had built its peace on a foundation of ignored pain. The betrayal had become communal, a collective weight that everyone had to carry. An elder muttered ominously near the fire, "This wedding will not end as it began." The unity of Obinna was crumbling under the pressure of the secrets Ijeoma had brought to the surface. It was a social collapse in real time, showing how one woman's refusal to stay silent can tear apart the fabric of a whole society. Amara watched the chaos and realized that her wedding was the sacrifice needed to burn away the rot that had infected their village for generations. Ijeoma moved through the fracturing crowd with a terrifying, silent authority. She didn't need to shout to enforce obedience, a single look or the subtle shift of a ceremonial knife was enough to keep the guests in line. Amara watched as Ijeoma moved the sharp blade used for the ritual sacrifice, its steel glinting in the moonlight as she placed it closer to the center of the altar. The quiet fear in the air was more intense than any loud chaos could have been. Amara's eyes widened in alarm as she realized that overt resistance was no longer just difficult, it was dangerous. The audience's tension reached a peak as they saw the hidden violence simmering beneath Ijeoma's calm exterior. She was no longer just a sister, she was a force of nature that would cut through anything that stood in the way of her mission. Amara felt a cold chill settle in her bones, realizing that her life was truly at the mercy of a woman who had been pushed past the point of no return. The silence of the compound was the silence of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The ritual reached its climax, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire ceremony would fail. The ritual fire, which had been burning steadily, suddenly flickered and almost died out, casting the courtyard into near total darkness. The ceremonial items on the altar began to tremble, and a collective panic rose among the villagers as they feared the spirits had completely turned their backs on Obinna. Amara stood frozen, her heart stopping as she watched the smoke turn a deep, sickly black. In the midst of the rising fear, only Ijeoma intervened. She stepped into the darkness, her voice rising in an ancient chant that no one had heard in years, her hand steady as she relit the flame. The audience questioned if the wedding would even survive the night. Was Ijeoma saving the ritual, or was she claiming it for herself? The stakes were higher than they had ever been, as the physical world seemed to mirror the spiritual battle being fought between the sisters. For a heartbeat, the village hung in the balance between redemption and destruction, and only Ijeoma seemed to have the power to decide which way the scale would tip. As the fire roared back to life, a flood of memories washed over Amara, moments of her own kindness that she now realized had been used as weapons against her sister. She remembered the times she had given Ijeoma her old clothes, thinking she was being generous, never realizing the sting of charity to a sister who deserved her own. She saw the tragic irony of her life, her every act of trust had been a brick in the wall of Ijeoma's resentment. The audience felt the moral tension reach its peak as they realized that Amara's goodness had been built on the invisible labor of her elder sister. Amara recognized her profound misjudgment of Ijeoma, seeing for the first time the scars that her own happiness had left on her sister's soul. Empathy deepened into a painful, suffocating weight. She wasn't just a victim of a scam, she was a participant in a long-term emotional erasure. The realization made her want to reach out and apologize, but the bridge between them had already been burned by the very fire that was now illuminating the truth of their shared history. The turning point came when Ijeoma stood before the elders and produced a series of documents hidden within her wrapper. With a voice that cut through the night like a cold wind, she exposed the family hypocrisy that had kept her in the shadows. She spoke of the debts her father had signed away using her future as collateral, revealing that she had been the one paying the price in secret for years. The audience experienced a second belief reversal as they began to side morally with Ijeoma. The whispers that rippled through the courtyard were no longer about her madness, but about the elder's shame. "She's not taking over," a villager whispered, his voice full of sudden respect. "She's correcting the wrongs that our leaders were too cowardly to face." The poetic justice was undeniable, Ijeoma was using the wedding, the very symbol of the family's future, to settle the accounts of the past. Amara watched as the leaders of her village bowed their heads, their faces pale under the flickering light. The truth was out, and it was a truth that stripped away the mask of the entire community, leaving them exposed in their moral failings. The emotional apex arrived in a final, climactic confrontation between the two sisters. They stood in the center of the ring, surrounded by villagers who were frozen in judgment, the air between them thick with the weight of decades of unspoken pain. Amara looked at Ijeoma and saw not a villain, but a mirror reflecting the cost of her own blindness. Tight shots of their faces showed the raw, jagged edges of their relationship, the love that had cuddled into a bitter need for justice. The moral weight of the moment was almost unbearable, leaving Amara feeling completely powerless. She realized that no matter what happened next, her life would never return to the simple fantasy she had cherished. At that moment, Ijeoma reached into a small leather pouch and pulled out a hidden document, an ancestral pact that proved the marriage was a legal trap designed to strip Amara of her own inheritance. The cliffhanger left the audience reeling, realizing that Ijeoma's takeover was the only thing that had prevented Amara from walking into a lifelong prison of her father's making. The truth was a double-edged sword that cut through the last of their illusions. The final reveal began as the light of the morning began to touch the horizon, illuminating the ledger and the ritual items in a cold, grey glow. The ancestral truth was finally laid bare for all to see. Amara's shock was profound as she read the terms of the pact her father had made. It was a debt that could only be settled by the total submission of the younger daughter to the groom's family. All prior judgments of Ijeoma were overturned in an instant. The audience realized that every one of Ijeoma's selfish acts, rearranging the flowers, whispering to the priest, taking over the vows, had been a calculated move to break the spiritual and legal bonds of that ancient, wicked contract. The tension shifted from the sisters to the elders and the groom, who had stood by and allowed this tragedy to almost reach its conclusion. Ijeoma had been the only one fighting for Amara's freedom, even if she had to use the language of betrayal to do it. The weight of the sacrifice was immense, as Ijeoma had traded her own reputation and the love of her sister to save the family from a spiritual debt that would have cursed them for generations. Justice was finally served, but it was a justice that felt heavy and bitter in the mouth. The villagers watched in silent horror as the full extent of the family's deception was exposed. The groom, Chidi, and his elders were forced to leave the compound in disgrace, their heads hung low as they realized the game was over. The poetic, karmic resolution was complete, but it left a lingering unease in the courtyard. Amara was left standing in her ruined wedding finery, powerless and alone, her heart a hollow chamber of grief and realization. Ijeoma, her mission finally complete, did not stay to be thanked or celebrated. She simply turned away from the altar, her face a mask of exhaustion and quiet resolve, and began to walk toward the gate. The audience watched as she disappeared into the morning mist, a woman who had saved everything but lost her own place in the world she had protected. The moral consequence was solidified, the family was saved, but the cost was the total destruction of the bond between the two sisters. It was a victory that felt like a funeral. The story closes in a haunting, reflective silence as the last of the candles fade out in the empty courtyard. The morning sun reveals the red earth, now scattered with the remnants of a wedding that never truly happened. Only the moral witness, the old Pa Ojo, retains the full memory of what transpired, sitting quietly in his corner and watching the dust settle. The village is left to reckon with the cost of their ignored pain and the weight of the secrets they tried to bury. There is no celebration, no music, only the absence of the two women who had stood at the center of the storm. The haunting silence is a reminder that ignored pain transforms into something powerful and inevitable, and that justice delayed is still justice that carries a terrible price. Ijeoma's shadow seems to linger in the corners of the compound, a ghost of the sister who took over a wedding to save a life. The viewers are left to debate the morality of her choices, wondering if they would have had the courage to be the villain in their own story to ensure the survival of those they loved. The lesson remains, a family's death is never truly hidden, and the truth will always find its way home through the fire.